Hi, welcome back to week 6 of Economic 360. Since this week is the last week of dealing with the theory, I figured that we might as well, since really the real topic is what are the basic explanations that have become popular post Heckscher-Ohlin, is that we should take probably advantage of this, and I'm going to repeat very quickly all the 15 or 16 assumptions that are required and that we have mentioned all throughout that lie behind the general equilibrium theory, the classical theory, and the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, because all the extensions that we're going to be mentioning post Heckscher-Ohlin are in essence critiques of the classical model and the Heckscher-Ohlin model by saying that they are not adequate in explaining the real world. And so in order for me not to forget any of these, forget mentioning any of these 15 or 16 assumptions, I wrote them down. So let me just go over them very quickly. All actors are expected to be rational. We have two countries and two goods, and the goods are supposed to be identical in each country. There is no money illusion, i.e. decisions are based on the real and not on the apparent. Factor endowments, that is, are constant, and so is technology in each of these countries. Perfect competition is the norm. Factor mobility between industries in each country. Communal indifference curves. Then the specific assumptions required for the Ricardian model: no factor mobility between countries, there are no trade barriers, and there's balanced trade. You have labor theory of value, and production is according to constant returns. For Heckscher, we have to drop obviously the labor theory of value, because we substitute for that, if you still remember, that we're going to have two factors of production right now, both capital and labor. So capital is paid a rental payment and labor is paid wages. Then you have identical technologies in both countries, and the countries have different endowment, and that's why Heckscher-Ohlin is known as the factor endowment theory. So based on this, many people have been looking around at the sign of the times, so to speak, and they've come to the conclusion that there are many things in the world that are in essence violations of very many of these models. And I think that's to be expected. It doesn't really mean, at least as far as I'm concerned, that the theories really don't apply. Yeah, they do mean that the theories don't explain every single thing that's happened, because the world has changed, the institutional structure has changed, mobility has changed. So yes, there are a few things that probably take place that are not in accordance to these theories, but I still am of the belief that trade essentially is really carried through according to the principles of comparative advantage and the Heckscher-Ohlin. The idea, for example, that is very often mentioned, especially, in your textbook starts with it by speaking about how is it that after NAFTA, we seem to export and import from Mexico very many of the very highly sophisticated goods, including even nuclear goods. Well, yes, it's true and it's not true at the same time, and the explanation is very simple, is that most of these goods are really engineered and produced in the United States. Then they're shipped to Mexico, whereby they're assembled because of the lower wages for assembly workers, and then they're shipped back to the United States. in that case, I think both countries have benefited from it, and it's not really such a gross violation. It's saying, though, in this case, that yes, the goods have become mobile between countries, when really we assumed in the Ricardian model that was developed 200 years ago, that yes, there was no such thing as major factor mobility between countries. So yes, we need to introduce some of these adjustments. As you can see, probably based on the board behind me, I have decided that we're going to talk only about 4 of these models. All of them, or actually not all of them, one of them is not mentioned at all in the book. One does not mention the precise measure, and the third one again does not use the illustration. So I'm going to speak a little bit about each of these 4, and potentially at the end I will mention a few words about even a 5th model that is mentioned in the book. So the first major deviation, if you want, that was developed post Heckscher-Ohlin was an effort that was started in the early 1960s. I believe it was something like 1961. And then it was basically developed, it matured in 1966 in a book by William Vernon. William Vernon used to teach at the MBA program at Harvard. So really most of these things that have become known as the product life cycle are really illustrations or attempts by business schools primarily to try and explain the patterns of trade that have taken place essentially in technological manufactured goods. They found out that the products of technology in the 60s and 70s appeared to be a slight deviation. But that was also the time, by the way, when the term transnational corporation and multinational corporation was also coined. So that phenomena of multinationalization was still very new, and people were also struggling to understand it. So what did it really say, this product life cycle? It was really a very simple explanation of trying to describe what is it that has taken place in the world. I don't think really there is a strong theory behind it, but yet this doesn't mean that it is not important in trying to understand what is it that has taken place. Essentially, really what it says is that a product is usually introduced. Remember, most of these things were introduced in the United States. So you're talking about major American multinational companies. One of the companies really that was used quite a lot as an example was Texas Instrument. So let's assume Texas Instrument goes out of its way in order to produce the first handheld calculator. And there's a story that I like to tell about this, but we really don't have the time. But I was fortunate enough to use the first handheld calculator produced by TI in 1971. It used to pay something like £1.50, has only 4 functions: addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. And it used to sell for something like $400. So once it was introduced, where do you think there was a market for it? There wasn't a market for it, obviously, let's assume, in Africa or in the poor Asian countries or in Latin America. So the market for it was essentially in the United States. So they introduced that product and they tried to develop a market for it in the United States. So here's the product that is introduced over here. This is the production. So as they are producing, all the consumption right now, and the production and the consumption is for the American market. Now, as the product advances, as it matures, then it becomes really much more uniform. And so it became slicker, more important, more capital intensive. People were using it more and more and what have you. So then TI started asking some of its subsidiaries overseas to start producing it. Once these subsidiaries started producing it, you get to a particular point whereby, I mean, this is where the subsidiaries start producing it. So initially the United States introduces the product, develops a domestic market for it, then the market starts spreading, this is assumed, to Europe. So the American production starts exporting to Europe. So right now there are exports from the United States. But then as the market develops some more and we start producing in Europe and then from Europe in other subsidiaries in Asia, then we start importing back to the United States. So as you can see, the exports from the United States start declining. They get to a particular point whereby even the overseas are exporting to the rest of the world. But then you get to a particular point at the end when the product is totally mature, whereby it's not produced in the United States any longer. So the product right now is going to be produced only overseas to supply the rest of the world and to supply the American market. A very good example of this, and that's why I mentioned TI, is really that simple handheld calculator. I don't think that TI or HP or anybody in the United States right now produces the small handheld calculator any longer. We've sloughed it off, in essence, to other countries. Right now, even I don't think that there are American companies probably that produce it, so we've moved along to something else. The same thing happened to the telephones, the old style telephones. The same thing happened to TV sets and many other electronic products. They are invented in the United States, the market is produced, the market matures, and as it matures, we slough it off, we start producing it in other countries. Right now, the process, by the way, has even changed from that time of William Vernon, because when William Vernon came up with this idea in 1966, there was no China. China had not opened yet to the rest of the world. So right now, instead really of speaking about the rest of the world, what we mean by that right now is China. The first thing that American companies do right now is that they move immediately to China. So China, in essence, has really replaced the rest of the world. But the important thing, one more time, is that you go through phases. The first phase is going to be to just introduce the product. It requires lots of technology. It is not as capital intensive initially. And then as it grows and it grows, it gets to a particular point at the end whereby it is totally imported from overseas. And obviously you have two phases in between. And there is a break-even point over here whereby we produce only what we want, and then all the exports from our subsidiaries are over there. This was applied to a very, very large number of specific goods. And it turned to be an explanation that was worthwhile for multinational corporations at the time. This is not the only diagram. You have a diagram that says essentially the same thing that's found in your book, and you'll find maybe 3 or 4 other diagrams, but essentially all of them speak about this transition from the immediate, from the first phase whereby a product is introduced, and as it develops, then it's no longer produced in the domestic country, but is going to be produced overseas. And so, as you can see, there is lots of trade as a result of this particular development. There is, however, another thing that is very important, and I had mentioned it, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe around a week ago, or maybe even 2 weeks ago, and that is known as the Bhagwati effect, that I think is very important, and unfortunately it's not mentioned in the book. And I believe that whenever you speak about trade, you've got to speak about the Bhagwati effect. This is the diagram of the Bhagwati effect. So let me make sure that we can go through it very simply so that you'll understand me. The Bhagwati effect is also known, or is better known, as the immiserization theory. IMMISERIZATION Serzation. That's to say, it is derived from the word misery, so it is really inflicting misery. So notice what is it that this theory is saying. This theory is saying that trade and economic growth could inflict misery on a particular set of countries that practice it. Now, it is not very widely spread, but it does happen. And so we've got to be on the lookout to make absolutely certain that we avoid the Dutch disease, if you still recall, which we discussed at length a couple of weeks ago, and also to be able to avoid the immiserizing effect of Bakwati. Now, this effect is not very common because it requires quite a very important set of assumptions. The country in question must be relatively dominant in the trade, in the exportation, in the supply of a particular item. And that item must play a huge role in that particular economy, must also be dominant in that economy. Over and above this, that particular item, that's why I included this very small diagram over here, so that in case some of you are not familiar with it, you'll be able to see it, is described as being price inelastic. A price inelastic, it means that if it so happens that you change the quantity by a little bit, but you increase it, then the price will have to drop substantially. And the same thing is true, but in the reverse. That's to say, if the quantity is decreased slightly, then the price is going to increase substantially. So how does growth lead to a worse level of welfare? I mean, that seems to be counterproductive. Exactly opposite to everything that we have said so far, isn't it? Because we said that trade is really the best engine of growth. It's the only means of economic development. Now notice this. What is a good example, by the way, of this? Probably the best example that I hope all of you can relate to will be Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are not the exact figures because I really wasn't going to use this as an example, but let's assume for the sake of the argument, and probably it's true, that say 75% of the GDP of Saudi Arabia is related to oil, and that Saudi Arabia exports, something like maybe 8 or 9 million barrels of oil every day. They produce around 10 or 11, so probably they consume locally around 1 or 2, and they export the rest. So Saudi Arabia at a particular point in time had this production possibility curve, this lower one. Now let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that they make major oil discoveries. So oil in this case is B. So what happens? The production possibility curve is still producing the same quantity of the other good, but is going to be producing that much more oil. Now, as the quantity of oil in the world increases, go back to this. So this increase in the quantity of oil is going to lower the price substantially. And by the way, I know that you're too young to remember this. I mean, in my case, I don't even need to read about it because I lived it. That's exactly what happened during the early part of the 80s. In the early part of the 80s, the price of oil went as high as $40 at one time, which is equivalent in current dollars probably to 140, 150 bucks. But then it dropped from 40 down to 8 within 2 or 3 years. And that's when our president at the time, Ronald Reagan, and Vice President George Bush Sr., went to Saudi Arabia and convinced the Saudis of increasing their oil output, and so the price of oil in the world dropped substantially. So this is really a very realistic model for Saudi Arabia. Now, what happened therefore to Saudi Arabia? Notice, when they were producing according to the old production possibility curve, this was the terms of trade. And so they were able to produce over here and to trade in order to be at this particular level of indifference curve. So they were at the top level of the indifference curves. But what happened when they increased their production? Now notice right now they're producing more of both goods. But yet the price is so different right now that their equilibrium is at a lower level of indifference. I mean, all what it's saying, by the way, is that Saudi Arabia, let's assume they were producing, just for the sake of the argument, 8 million barrels, and let's assume that they were selling every barrel at 40. So 8 times 40 would have been, what, $320 million a day. And then they increased their production, say, to 10 million, but right now they're selling them at only, say, $20 a day. So that becomes 200 million. So they have cut down, therefore, their revenue, in essence, from 320 million to 200 million. So although the country is producing more in physical goods, it has less money available to it in order to invest, in order to import, and so it becomes at a lower level of indifference. So in this particular case, actual growth through trade has really contributed to a lowering of the level of welfare of that particular country. Now, I hope that this is true. I'm sorry, I mean it is clear, because it's not mentioned at all in the book. If it's not, drop me a note and we'll see if we can do anything else about it. The other, or the third, important development post Heckscher-Ohlin that has become very popular is the fact that, if you still recall the assumptions, one of the reasons that I decided to go through all of these assumptions is that usually a country exports one good and imports another. If you still recall, in the Ricardian model, it's 100% specialization. In the Heckscher-Ohlin model, it doesn't have to be 100% specialization, but it can come close to it. But yet, you only export, let's assume, cloth, and you import wine. So everybody really specializes in one thing. Now, if that's true, then we ask the question that we sort of raised at the beginning of the today's session, is that what do we do then, or how do we explain the fact that if you go into a wine store, you find out that you have French wine in the United States, you go to Paris and you find out that they have California wine. That's to say, we import wine and we export wine. If that doesn't seem as if really it's a major item to you, probably one of the best examples would be commercial aircraft. How many companies are there in the world that produce commercial aircraft on a very large scale? Essentially, really two. I know that there's a small company in Canada and a small company in Brazil, and even much smaller companies in Japan and in Europe. But essentially, it's either Boeing or Airbus. So what do American companies do? Well, Airbus obviously, Boeing exports its products all over the world. Practically every single airline, commercial airline in the world, flies some Boeings. At one time, probably around 20 years ago, it was essentially only Boeing. But right now, we do export quite a lot of airplanes. But then what do American companies do? Do American commercial trunk carriers fly only Boeing? And the answer is no. Because as you all well know, some of them fly Airbus. And so the United States exports airplanes and imports airplanes. We export cars, we import cars. We export wine, we import wine, and what have you. So this is really a gross violation of one of the ideas of the basic models of Heckscher and Olin, whereby there is more or less that kind of a specialization, and everyone is going to have a comparative advantage only in the production of one good. One of the best explanations of this is the Linder theory. That's to say, a theory that tries to explain the flows of trade on the basis of the demand side rather than the supply side. All our explanations up until now, at least Heckscher and Olin and Ricardo, were really based on the supply side. Who is it that can produce it more efficiently and at a better price? Now, in this case, what we're saying is that, yes, we export and import the same good based on the fact that of consumer taste. So consumers demand French wine, and consumers demand that we fly, say, the Airbus A380, or the Europeans, they demand that they want to drink California wine, and so on and so forth. So where does this come from? It comes from, according to this theory, and we're going to give it, by the way, a name. It is called intra-industry trade. Now, the intra-industry trade cannot be explained by any of our Heckscher, Olin, or definitely Ricardo. That's why it's looked upon as a violation. Now, what's interesting about this is to note that when you go ahead and you look at the volume of intra-industry trade, that's to say the same item is both exported and imported by a country, you will find out that essentially this is a phenomena of being well off. It is really essentially in the developed countries. And in these developed countries, that's where the consumer tastes are so well developed that a product differentiation becomes very important for the consumer. I mean, I know a person in the United States that loves French cars. And so that person will never drive an American car and will pay tremendous, or not tremendous, but a very large sum of money in order to import, say, a Peugeot or a Renault or whatever the case might be. And the same thing is true of all other things. So how do we know how much trade that there is? Well, there is a way of measuring it. The measure is this, and again, it's not mentioned in the book. The measure is very simple. You can, in essence, if you want to really forget about that 100, because some people measure it without the 100, some people do 100. You know, it's as if you're talking about a percentage term, or you go ahead and you multiply. Let's say is point 0.1, or you go ahead and you multiply it by 100, so it becomes 10%. So 0.1 is the same thing as 10%. So what it is that it is 1 minus the difference of between the export and imports in that particular good. Let's assume we're talking about cars. So if this is for the United States, how many, or what, in dollar terms, for example, the volume spent on the exports of cars and the volume spent on the imports of cars, so it's X minus M. All of that is expressed as a fraction of both exports and imports. The measure, once you multiply it by 100, becomes really, and remember, it's 1 minus this, so it's going to be very close to 100. That is the highest level that it can have. And the lowest level, obviously, will be practically 0. But notice, therefore, when is it that it will be 100? This will be 100 when the exports and then import in a particular industry are exactly the same. let's assume that a particular industry, say wine, we export 100 million and we import 100 million. So what is X minus M? It's going to be 0. So 0 over anything is 0. So 1 minus 0 is 1. 1 times 100 is 100. So the highest level will be when you have a balanced trade. Now, just to give you a very simple idea, these might not be very visible on the board, but I put them here so that I wouldn't forget to mention them to you. These are rough, and they are probably of around 6 or 7 years ago, but these things don't change very rapidly. In the UK, for an index of all the goods and services that are traded, the UK has inter-industry trade of 85, France 83, the US around 77. But then, just to give you an example about what will happen, for example, in Pakistan, it's actually under 7. I think in Pakistan it was, according to this, something like 6.5. So what I'm saying is that this phenomena is normally found only amongst the developed countries, whereby you have these sophisticated consumers that can afford to be very demanding, and so they will be very much influenced by product differentiation. But as you go down the economic ladder to countries that are less well off, then it becomes less of a representation of the flows of trade in the world. So this really, by the way, is only for, again, essentially manufactured goods. But it also shows that, yes, some of the conclusions are violated only once we become very well off. And so the poorer countries that are unfortunately, 80% of the world, do not experience as much the intra-industry trade as we do. In order to move on, and in order to not to make this much longer, there is another important explanation of the terms of trade, or the effect of trade post-Heckscher. Maybe the best champion of this, by the way, is a person that probably all of you are familiar with. I hope at least that you are familiar with. He writes twice a week in the New York Times. He's probably the best known economist right now in the world, and that is Professor Krugman. Now, Professor Krugman, one of the reasons that he got his Nobel Prize a few years ago in economics was this. I mean, the model obviously is much more sophisticated, but I wanted to give you a very simple illustration of this. And he tried to explain some of the patterns of trade by speaking about the fact that, if you still recall, one of the major assumptions that we spoke about, and we mentioned it en passant, but definitely it's really a crucial assumption, is that perfect competition is the norm. Now, I hope that all of you know what is perfect competition. Perfect competition means that there is so much competition that there are no profits, that you have a very large number of firms, that the products are identical, and so on and so on. So, have we ever had perfect competition? Do we have right now perfect competition? Are we likely to have perfect competition? And the answer to all of these things is probably no. And so Professor Krugman said, therefore, to understand the flows of trade in the world right now, we need to look at the imperfectly competitive market structures. And to show you really an illustration about what that means, you've got to combine both imperfect competition, actually monopolistic competition, which can grow, by the way, into an oligopoly, but both of them come to the same conclusion, and the idea of increasing returns to scale. Remember, in all the Heckscher and Olin and Ricardo, we assume that we have constant returns to scale. So right now we're going to be talking about increasing returns to scale. What is the easiest definition? The easiest definition is that in a constant returns to scale, you double your inputs and you double your outputs. In an increasing returns to scale, you double your inputs, but say, for example, you triple or quadruple your output. Now, what's the implication of this? The implication for this is very simple. I hope all of you have already arrived at that conclusion, but just in case you have not, it shows really that the average cost decreases as the level of output increases in an increasing returns to scale. What's a very good example? Let's go back, by the way, to the idea of Boeing that we had mentioned earlier. Let's assume Boeing is going to develop a new airplane. I think that the cost is over $10 billion. It's around $10 to $12 billion. So all of these are really fixed costs. These are sunk costs. If they're going to produce, say, for the sake of the argument, only 10 copies, then what's going to be just the fixed cost of each one of these airplanes? It's going to be $1 billion. If they're going to be producing 100, then the fixed cost becomes 100. If they're going to be producing 1,000, then it becomes 10. If they're going to be producing 10,000, it becomes 1, and so on and so forth. And that's why whenever you want to develop such an aircraft, you want to make sure that you get an adequate level of orders so that the price will not be, so that the average cost will not be up here, but so that it will be, let's assume, down here. And that's why, by the way, also, it takes them a very long time in order to start booking money, booking profits from a new airplane, because initially they're going to be just, most of the revenue will go towards covering these sunk costs. And sometimes, I believe in the 747, that was one of the most successful airplanes in the world, it took them, of the large airplanes in the world, it took them something like probably over 10 years before they really broke even. So what are the implications of this on trade? Well, how does the market grow? The market grows as a result of exports. Here's an excellent example. What I had in mind over here is really something like a car company. Take Honda. So Honda is facing increasing returns to scale, and this is the demand for Honda cars, say, only in Japan. So if this is the demand for Honda cars and this is the supply, therefore they will produce this many units, but at this price. So this upper price, say, for example, is $20,000 a unit. But then they develop a market in the United States. So the demand shifts as a result of the exports. As the demand shifts, then notice where they're going to become right now. So instead of operating at a point whereby the average cost per unit is $20,000, it's going to drop to, say, $12,000. And therefore, the quantity supplied is going to increase. So the greater it is, the more beneficial it's going to be for all the consumers all over the world, and the more dominant is Honda going to be. Because once Honda starts producing over here, it will be difficult for others to come ahead and compete with it. So trade in this particular case is essentially offering that particular company, whether it's a monopolistic competition or an oligopoly, an advantage over other companies, because as it grows, it will start encountering lower and lower average cost curves, and so it will become more difficult for other firms to enter this particular field and offer any meaningful competition. This probably, by the way, is one of the single most important violations, if you will, in the world. And this is true not only of this, it's true of all the criticisms of mainstream economics. Because mainstream economics essentially is based on perfect competition. And we've allowed our industries to grow to such an extent whereby perfect competition does not exist any longer. Actually, we don't have it in probably any field whatsoever, neither domestically nor internationally. And so these are some of the shortcomings of everything in microeconomics. And now, before we really end this session, let me just say only very, very few words, because I've found out that some students, for one reason or another, as simple as it is, have had difficulty in understanding what's referred to as the gravity theory. Now, the gravity theory, maybe some students have a difficulty because they don't have a science background. It really is a term that is borrowed from physics. If you remember the fact that a gravity theory is directly borrowed from physics, then I don't think you'll have any problem, because it doesn't really say that much. So gravitational forces, as you probably know, they increase proportionally to the size of the two planets or objects that you're talking about. So the gravitational forces between, let's assume, the sun and the moon are proportional to the size of the sun and the moon. The gravitational forces between us and the sun are proportional to the sizes of the earth vis-a-vis the sun. If the earth was going to become much larger, then the gravitational forces with the sun will increase. If we are to become smaller and shrink, then the gravitational forces will decrease. That's why, again, one of the difficulty of sending spaceships as small as they might be right now into outer space is to be able to go through the gravitational forces. When you go ahead and send, let's assume, a satellite to a very, very high altitude, or you send a spaceship to Mars, the difficulty essentially is really to be able to escape the gravitational forces of the planet Earth. And because remember, the satellite is very small, planet Earth is very big, so the gravitational force is very strong. But the other important thing about gravitational forces is the distance. As the satellite moves away from the planet, from planet Earth, then the gravitational forces are going to weaken and weaken and weaken. So the higher it goes, the weaker is the gravitational force, and the less is going to be the demand for a power to keep it moving on. And that's why the rockets will fire only for a very specific period of time, after which there wouldn't be any gravitational forces from planet Earth, and so it will be able to keep going on its way. Now, I don't know, I'm not pretending to be a physicist, but if you take away this idea of saying that the gravitational forces depend on the size of the two elements that you're talking about, and the other thing is the distance, and you apply them to countries, it essentially is saying that two large countries are going to trade with each other because of the mass, therefore there's going to be more of gravitational forces between them. And the best example of that that I could think of, that all of us can relate to, is probably really the United States. Who are our major trade partners? Take exports or imports, it makes really no difference. I'm not going to name them in exact order, but as you all well know, it's probably China, and let's take the EU as a group, instead of naming Germany, France, England, Italy, and what have you. So you have the EU, and you have China, you have Japan, and you have Canada, and you have Mexico. What becomes very obvious is that our exports to them and our imports from them, they are our number one markets for export, and they are our number one market for imports also. What's common between them? Most of them, not all of them, most of them are large countries. So the United States and China, the United States and the EU, the United States and Japan, and not only, by the way, geographic size, we're talking really about the size of the economy. So the Japanese are the third largest economy in the world. The EU is probably, as a group right now, is still probably larger than the United States. It might have, as a result of the recession, right now be equal to the United States. The EU as a whole, all the countries together. And China, many people expect it to surpass the United States in the next 6 or 7 years. So as you can see, we're saying, therefore, these large countries are always going to be trading together. What is the exception? The exception is Canada, or Mexico for that matter. These are also two major countries of ours. So why do we trade with them if they're not such large economies? Although Canada, by the way, in its own right is a large economy. But yet, it is the proximity. So in this particular case, Canada and Mexico are an example of two countries that are trading quite a lot with the United States, but not only because of their size, it is because of their proximity. That's to say, remember, the gravitational forces are strong when the two objects are very large, and they are strong when the two objects are very close to each other. Another example of this, by the way, maybe a better example in a sense, will be Australia. Australia, again, exports quite a lot its raw materials to China, the United States, and Japan, a little bit to New Zealand, and it imports most of its goods from the United States, Japan, and China, and a little bit from New Zealand. So what's common in all of these things is that the United States, Japan, and China are large established economies. New Zealand is not, but New Zealand is next doors. So the first market that a New Zealand company is going to look for in order to export will be Australia. The first market probably that an Australian company would look forward to would be New Zealand. So as you can see, the gravitational model, all what it really says, it depends on your geographic location and the size of your economy, i.e. large economies tend to trade with each other more, and they tend to trade also with the next door neighbor. So with that, therefore, I will leave you with this, and just a quick reminder that we will we won't have a session the week after, because that's when we're going to have our midterm. Thank you, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.